but I think this is just beautiful. I remember learning this in school where if you take your two ears and you look at the shape, it's
Yeah.
right? Isn't that cute?
Yeah.
If you love someone, you'll listen to them, right?
That.
Isn't that so great? And I think that's why therapy has just blown up because some people don't have people in their life, but a lot of us do. But there's something about having someone who's just going to be there objectively, authentically for you. And the way they ask questions is like, well, how do you feel about that? And it's just, and then I think we need that. Like we crave it, you know? I think that's why it's so powerful, like with therapy, and why people, even technically, even though they could be done with it and graduate, they continue and stay on.
Right. It's really, I know somebody who's a therapist, and she told me about an ad that she saw, that the ad was, everybody deserves an hour. It's just like an hour a week to just talk about what you need. And everybody deserves that. You don't need to have a crisis going on in your life.
So feel me when I bring it, sing it loud. I'm from the loot and I'm proud, run a mile for the cause. I'm right.
Hi guys, it's your girl Nechama, your favorite Jew from the Lou. Welcome back to my podcast. And today I am so excited to have Elisheva with us, formerly Elisheva Pollack. What's your last name, your married last name?
And now it's Elisheva Steinbrecher.
Steinbrecher. Okay. I kept thinking it was like Brecher, and I'm like, no, I feel like it's probably not that.
Yeah, it took me about a year to figure out.
That's okay. That's okay. We all get there eventually. So I always love to start by saying like how I know my guests. And we both grew up in St. Louis. I mean, obviously I'm still here, but you moved away in what, 2004, 2005?
Yeah, in 2005 when I was like 10, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's been a long time, and we honestly haven't really stayed in touch or connected at all. Like, obviously St. Louis is so small that you kind of remember people, but you're always like, what happened to them? Right. And then you reached out to me. Oh gosh, my brother Chaim, his episode came out and he attributed his inspiration for teaching to your dad. And then you reached out being like, that was so awesome to hear. I've been listening to your podcast. And I was like, that's crazy. So maybe we should start with, how did you get like into listening to my podcasts? How did that happen?
It was literally that. Zahava Cohn sent me, maybe Simon Cohn?
Simon, yeah.
Simon. She sent me the link to the podcast with your brother on it. And she told me, she was like, listen to the first 15 minutes. She mentions your father here. And then like 10 minutes later, she was like, he mentions your father a few times. So you should probably listen to the whole thing. And I did. And then I started following you. I haven't listened to every episode, but I've listened to a
There's a lot. But I mean, I always tell people, I'm like, I have ADD, and really like this podcast isn't like a series. You don't have to like listen from start to finish in order to be like in the know. It is interesting for people if they do it that way, but honestly, you can just skip around and do whatever is interesting and intriguing to you.
Mm-hmm. Right. I like that. You have a wide variety of topics, and everybody that's on is just so different. So you bring out such a different side of everybody and yourself with each thing.
Totally. And it is interesting because there's certain ones where I'm like barely talking and the guest is talking the entire time. And then there's other ones where like it's conversation and we're just chit chatting. So it really just depends on the vibe. And I just kind of feel the energy and see like what my guest needs. But I also I was a consumer first before I was a podcast host. And I feel like a lot of podcasts have specific themes. I'll start listening to a few episodes and then I get kind of bored and then I move on. But with this, literally, you never know what you're going to get next. But for this podcast episode, I think it's really special because your dad's yahrzeit. And for my non-Jewish listeners, that's like, how do you say this in English?
Like the death day anniversary.
The death day anniversary. Yeah, it's coming up. And we talked months ago about doing an episode. And I had never done this. You're my first guest doing like not actually like in person. And so I had never done this before. And I was looking into the right technology. And I think we finally found something. So thank you for being my guinea pig.
Of course, anytime. I'm happy to be here. Yeah,
I'm so excited. This is going to be great. But you mentioned like such an interesting topic, which was like what it's like when a parent has passed at a young age and then almost growing up with like a famous parent and everyone's telling you all these amazing stories, but you were so little that you don't actually remember them in that way. So it's almost like you're remembering them vicariously through those memories. So I'd love to just dive right in there and talk about your experiences.
Sure, yeah. That's kind of what made me, I actually now am looking to get in touch with the people who my father taught and hear their memories. Because when I heard your brother talk about how, he attributed his whole career to my father, I was like, there's probably so many people who felt the same way.
Yeah.
Maybe not in their career, but who they attribute something in their life to, that teacher who they love. Now I'm just, trying to get in touch with different students to hear what they know, because I didn't get to know him so well.
Right. And it was really cool with my brother too, because like, honestly, I didn't even know that story about my brother. Like my brother was talking about how like it was, first of all, the fact that he opened up about his parents, like my mom and his dad's, because for those who don't know the story, my parents, it's their second marriage. So my brothers are from my mom's first marriage, and they were really little when they divorced. And my brother opened up about it on his episode, which was super vulnerable and brave. And I did not plan that, wasn't expecting it at all. And like just the fact that like your dad was there and like reached out and saw a little boy who was struggling and like didn't let him fall behind on his potential was super special.
Yeah, actually, when I heard that episode, I thought that it was sort of planned, that there was some sort of itinerary of what you and your brother are going to be talking about. And now being on your podcast, I realized it was really off the cuff, everything. And it made it all the more genuine.
What I would love to talk about is something that you mentioned was that there's actually quite a few, I guess, adults at this point now who have this experience of having lost a parent at a young age, and then having that experience of everyone coming over to them and sharing all these beautiful stories, which is really nice to hear because you, in a sense, had lost that piece of that parent through that childhood. So what's that community like? Because obviously you guys are like talking with each other and like supporting each other. So I didn't even realize that this was a thing. So I'd love to hear more about that experience.
So it's not so much a community. It's just I have a bunch of friends who there's an organization called Links, which is an organization for people who lost a parent when they were young. And they have Shabbatones, mostly for high schoolers. So I used to go to them. And it was really nice because there'd be these Shabbatones that have 100+ girls who were Hasidim or Sfardim or off the derech, or there were random people from like England who would fly over for these Shabbatones. And the only thing we all had in common was we had lost a parent. And we would spend the Shabbos just kind of, it wasn't even necessarily sad. Most of the time it was actually a lot of morbid jokes that people would share.
Which is also really nice.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. It's like what a lot of us needed. So from that, I have a bunch of very good friends who all of us lost a parent when we were young. And now as adults, many of us are married with kids. And we're trying to navigate the different like throes of parenthood with like, what did my parents do in this situation? Or how did my parents react? And then, now realizing, wait, I didn't actually have that parent around. So knowing all of these stories from different people about my father now, it made me realize how much I don't know. Because what was it? When my son was 4, so I have a son, Reuven, who's named after my father. For, I guess, anybody who doesn't know, my father's name was Rabbi Pollack. And he was Rebbe in St. Louis for a long time, a teacher in St. Louis. And so my son's named after him. And when my son was 4, he asked me to tell him some stories about his Zaidi Reuven. And I realized all the stories I knew were not appropriate for a 4-year-old because they're all like different pranks that he pulled on people. That were all very funny, but not something that you would really explain to a 4-year-old. And I realized like in that moment that all these times I'd meet people and they would tell me that they loved my father, they knew him, he changed their life, he was incredible. They would repeat the same, 5 famous stories that I'd heard. And I had this realization of all these people had my father as a sort of role model, but I can't even tell my own child what that role model looked like.
Yeah.
Role modeling looked like.
Yeah, that's so back me up in the story. Cause like, again, you were about, so I guess if you were as a Hava Simon's class, so you were 2 years.
I think she's older than me.
Okay. So you were 1 grade above me.
Yes, I think
Were
so.
you at Epstein? Was that the
I
school
was
you went to?
Epstein, and the girls in my class were like Devorah Siegel and Yael Tobin. Devorah
Yeah,
Height was my age, but at Torah Prep, I know she was a guest.
totally. Okay, so we were in different schools. We were a year apart. And I think like the only times we were really together was like summer camp.
Mm-hmm.
Because like there
Summer
really
camp.
was.
Our parents were friends, so
Right.
we also just got together on Shabbos a lot. Yeah, I remember going to your house a lot.
My family used to have so many guests over. It was so nice. Like my parents have always been huge on having like guests over. And so I think like COVID was so like hard for our family, but we couldn't do that anymore, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But like I feel like you guys had a really big family. I'm trying to remember all the details now, but I feel like my memory's so hazy. How many siblings do you have?
Sure, I'll give you the rundown.
Yeah.
So there's 7 of us.
Oh
I'm
my
the
gosh.
youngest. I have 6 older siblings, 5 brothers, and 1 sister.
Yes. Oh my gosh, this is all coming back to me. I feel like I remember like a Pesach Seder when you guys were eating at our house. I don't know why, but I have like this specific memory of like in our living room and there being this like long table. I don't know why, but that memory just popped into my head. That's so random.
Yeah, that probably was after we moved away to Baltimore, well, to Silver Spring and then Baltimore. We came back to St. Louis 2 different times on Pesach. So that was probably one of those, because when we were in St. Louis, we always had a huge Seder at our house. That's one
Right.
of the few things I do remember.
It's so crazy. Do you ever think about like what your life would have been like if you guys would have stayed in St. Louis?
I always do.
Really?
Yeah, whenever I had like difficulties in high school, I'd always feel like this wouldn't happen in St. Louis. Um, or now even I wonder like what would it be like to just kind of, even if like my mother still lived there, go visit and just see every place where I grew up all the time. Go back to Stacy Park and go back to Simon Cohn's, which is not Simon Cohn's anymore.
R.I.P.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be. I don't know. I don't know how I would, where I would be if we hadn't left St. Louis. If I would still be there, somehow could get to Baltimore where my husband is.
I'm a big believer that we always end up exactly where we're supposed to be. But it is weird sometimes to think about if one thing would have been different, how the whole trajectory of our lives would have been different, right? Like I ended up staying in St. Louis. I didn't even go out of town for like seminary or college or anything like that. And I think about so many times about how if I would have done one thing differently, all the people, all the jobs that I've had, like they wouldn't be in my life, which is so crazy. Would have been not bad, just different, right? Yeah. So for you growing up, like what is like some of your favorite stories about your dad that just really you want to share?
So there's a few stories that are very famous that anybody who they like meet me, they'll be like, "Oh, do you know the Pope story?" And I'm like, "That one everybody tells me," which is there was a time in the 90s where the Pope was coming to St. Louis. That's true. The Pope did come to St. Louis. And the Vad Ha'ir, which is, I guess, the group of rabbis that just kind of do the
Run the
country.
city.
They run the city.
Yeah. It sounds like our own little Vatican with rabbis, but yeah.
A little bit. So
Yeah.
they got a letter in the mail that appeared to be on real Vatican letterhead. That it was a letter saying the Pope is coming to St. Louis and he would like to use the mikveh. And once he uses it, he would like to take out 7 gallons of holy water to disperse among the masses. And if anyone has any questions, they can contact Brother Gabriel the monk. And it was not from the Vatican. My father had written this letter, and he assumed that when they saw the sentence, Brother Gabriel the monk, there was a Rabbi Gabriel Monk from St. Louis.
Yes.
And he thought that that sentence would make the VAD realize that it was a joke, but
Yeah.
the VAD got the letter, and apparently a few people freaked out and were very worried about what to do and how to tell the Pope that he can't use a mikveh before somebody realized that it was a joke.
Insane. What a great story.
Mm-hmm.
Was he like always into pranking? Like, how did that even?
Yeah, he always did pranks wherever he was, any city. It could be that no person was off limits, but all of it was done in jest. So now that I'm looking for stories, people are emailing me, not necessarily different pranks, but just how he never made anybody feel bad when he would do something. Like, nobody was like the butt of the joke, sort of a thing. But everything he did was to make people smile. So our sukkah every year, it like looked like a haunted house. There were spider webs everywhere. And,
Awesome.
right? And I remember there was a rubber chicken hanging in it, beef for kaparos, that like for Yom Kippur.
It's hilarious.
And his classroom he hung up at the end of the year a Terminator poster from the movie The Terminator. It said, "I'll be back," but he took a picture of himself and put it on the head. So it was like, Rabbi Pollack will be back.
And hilarious. Love that. That's what's so interesting to me, because like I was talking to someone about this today, where it's like people hear Jewish Orthodox, right? Or Orthodox Jews, and there's so much stigma around it where people are just like, oh, you guys are super strict and there's not much leeway and there's not much you guys can do. But I think this is just such good proof that there's so much personality and fun. And like my other brother Moshe and we just talked about this in our last episode about how like within the realms of Judaism there's still so much room for your personality. Like your dad's personality is so unique. I don't think I've heard of any other rabbi like doing these kinds of pranks. But it's just so awesome because it just kind of lightens the mood, you know, because sometimes it can get intense. It's religion after all. There is a certain seriousness to it, but it doesn't mean you can't have fun and be playful with it.
Exactly. So I think he found a really good medium of making, like he got his students to be very interested in learning just by having fun with them at the same time. There was one story he had where the principal was going around to watch the teachers teach and see how they're teaching. So he decided, he and his students, to mess with the principal, they created a chair that looked like an electric chair, so it had wires sticking out of it and just like random buttons all over. And the principal came in the room, and my father asked somebody, "What does Ani lo yodea mean?" And a boy said, "I don't know." And Ani lo yodea does mean I don't know. And the boy, my father looked at him and said, "What do you mean you don't know?" And the boy said, "Rabbi Pollack, I don't know." And he said, "What do you mean I don't know? What does Ani lo yodea mean?" And the boy said, I don't know. So my father said, "Okay, well, this means the chair." And the boy, his eyes got big. Everybody else was like, "Don't send him to the chair. No, not the chair." He went to the chair. My father clicked a button. The boy started shaking himself. And the principal left the room because he did not want to be in there. So somehow, like, students, of course, they wanted to learn because he would make it fun. He would, like, get them into... They were a team, and they would have fun, and he would use his teaching in order to do that.
We really need more teachers like that, honestly, because I don't think I had one teacher my entire experience who was like anywhere close to that ever.
Right. So the interesting thing is, because everybody focuses on telling the funny stories, I never hear any of the real stories of... Like, for me, I have one teacher that was like that, where she really believed in me, and I couldn't really read Hebrew, actually. It's very interesting. Like, my father was Rabbi Pollack. I didn't really know how to read Hebrew until I was 16. I might have been dyslexic. I'm not really sure. But when I was 16, I had this teacher, and she told me that she isn't going to let me fall through the cracks, and she's not going to let me get away with it, and she's going to treat me like everybody else. And she learned with me, like, during lunch breaks sometimes. She would review things with me, and I passed her class, and she graded me the same way she did everybody else, so it means I really earned the grade. And I love hearing those stories because I feel everybody focuses on the things that are so funny, and yet there's so many so many people have told me, like, my father's their inspiration for something, but then they're telling me a funny story. I'm like, well, what was the story that inspired you? What was the story that made you who you are?
Right, and I feel like my brother Chaim's story was a little bit more of that serious side, right? He didn't really go into, like, the pranks and the fun part as much. It was more about, like, he saw something in my brother, and he even called my mom to be like, hey, he can do better. Wow, and, by the way, just side note, I totally relate to struggling with reading Hebrew. Because I don't know why. So reading English, I remember when I was in first grade, I was in, like, the lowest reading level. And my dad took me to Barnes and Nobles and he really believed in me. And there was like this little book where there was like, I'm very visual. And so there's this mouse who was like driving a crane and there was the word at. And it was like the mouse was lowering the C. And for some reason, that visual just clicked something in me. And once that click happened, in 1 month, I went from the lowest reading level to the highest reading level in English. But for some reason, Hebrew, I always struggled with. And it was just something that I had to work like 10 times harder than anyone else. Even like at the end of this podcast, like I always say like my Hebrew quote from Pirkei Avos, like what it's based on. For some reason, like sometimes like I lock up even when I'm saying it. It's so interesting. And I think because like my dad's a ger or like a convert, I never thought it was like a big deal. Because, you know, like you grow up with your family and that's normal. And then I remember one time we were eating somewhere and like my dad was saying Kiddush because the husband wasn't home. And my dad was like stumbling on the Hebrew words a little bit and the kids were laughing at my dad. And I didn't know that it was weird that he stumbled sometimes because that's what I was used to. And then when he stumbled, I was like, I remember being so embarrassed. And then feeling like because I was the daughter of a convert, like I had to work that much harder almost to prove my Judaism. Yeah, just side note. So I relate.
Yeah, I relate to that so much. I also, English, I could read. I was such a good reader. I remember reading the first 3 Harry Potter books in first grade.
I knew you were going to say Harry Potter.
I loved Harry Potter so much.
Which house were you?
I mean Gryffindor, but that was just because I answered what a Gryffindor would answer.
Right.
Probably more of a Ravenclaw if I were honest. But I remember like I could read everything and anything, and for Hebrew I just did not get it. And I think part of the reason I actually kind of got away with not learning it was because my father had passed away when I was 6. And then first grade, when you start learning Hebrew in kindergarten or first grade, I just didn't get it. And I think that it's possible my teachers just kind of thought that maybe I was grieving or that things were too hard, and so they weren't going to push me. But I just did not get Hebrew, and I have a very good memory, not photographic or anything insane, but like that. I was able to kind of fake it, so my teachers didn't realize that I couldn't read. And so I had this teacher in 10th grade, and that I really struggled with, and tried to put the words together, somehow passed. But when I was 20, I taught kindergarten in a local school, and I had to actually teach them how to read. So I learned how to read like the lessons the night before.
That's so great. I think about this sometimes where I'm like, I can't wait to be a mom because I feel like there's so much you lose when you're not in school anymore. And there's so much that like, I feel like learning with them will make me learn more, right?
Right, like now I know what Parsha is because my son comes home and he has his projects. I'm like, yeah, that's what happened. Okay, cool.
Right, and it comes back to you, but it's really nice to hear it almost like in the Cliff Notes because that's what like 3-year-old, 4-year-old are learning, right?
And that's also what I remember. Like when in high school you learn all these like extra midrashim. I don't remember all the little details, but I remember that like Joseph had a Technicolor coat.
Right, literally. So are you a teacher now?
I'm not.
Okay.
So I actually had, when I was 18, around 12th grade, decided I was going to become a play therapist. And part of it was because I wanted to help people like my father had. And also I loved working with kids. I, had babysat all the time. I'm the youngest of 7, so I have like so many nieces and nephews.
Oh, I bet, yeah.
So I really wanted to be a play therapist, and when I got my undergrad, it was I got into psychology with a minor in education, and I applied to social work school, and the first time I applied, I didn't get in, so I was looking for something to do the next year, and a local school TA actually had an elementary school position open, so I took it, and I figured, hey, this is either going to be a complete mess or it'll be fun. That year I met my husband, and we decided that he was still in school, like getting his undergrad, so we decided he'd finish undergrad and I would teach, and then when he finishes, I'll go back to school. I ended up teaching for 3 years, loved it, I loved every minute of it, and I miss it. The only reason I'm not doing it now is because I hate report cards with a passion, but I love teaching, I loved my kids so much. And when COVID happened, I had a 1-year-old at home. And anyway, like I wasn't going anywhere. So I decided to see, try and get my master's now.
Nice.
And yeah, so I actually started my master's in social work 4 years ago, almost 5, with a 1-year-old, and I was pregnant with actually a high-risk baby. I took off a semester of school when my second was born, and then went back to school. So it took me 4 years, but I got my master's in social work.
Yeah.
One of my internships, I was interning as a play therapist, and I realized that when you're 18 and you say you want to work with kids, it sounds good. But then when you actually have a 4-year-old and, you have a patient who's a 4-year-old or a client who's a 4-year-old and that client's in an abusive situation and your child is sad because he wants strawberries, it just kind of makes it really hard to be a mom and a therapist at the same
That's
time.
a really good point, actually.
I've heard of a few people that did that they just changed their career trajectory when they had kids because it's really hard to be there emotionally for patients and clients when you're also. So I'm currently now a geriatric therapist. So, and I work with all of my patients are 65 and up, and I really love it.
Honestly, with my dad having dementia, they say, like, specifically with dementia, patients, they almost have this disposition of like a 5 to 6-year-old, right? And like, there's something about going to like nursing homes and seeing like the elderly. They really almost go back to their childhood sweetness in a sense, or the childhood wounds that they need healed as well. So I think it's really special that you're doing that too, because I feel like that's a specific age bracket that's kind of overlooked. And not a lot of people have the patience or the care, because little kids are cute and they have their whole life ahead of them. You're investing in the future. But a lot of times, like people who are older, I think if I were to psychoanalyze it, I think maybe people are afraid of their own mortality, right? Like it's
100%.
scary.
It's really also a lot of my patients are people. So I work for a nursing home, so they're patients rather than clients. If I were working in a therapist office, then it would be more client based. But my patients are really, a lot of them, their children just don't have the time to talk to them, and they just need someone to talk to about either what's going on in their life now, or they have all these like childhood traumas, and they're because of some mental decline, like they're going kind of back to that, and they need to work through it. And it's really, a lot of them, they're going through a lot of this like grief, of future grief, of knowing, a lot of their friends have passed on, or they know that they might pass on soon, sooner rather than later. And I'm so privileged to be able to work with them in this time, and it just makes me be so much more grateful for my mother, who she's actually around the same age as a lot of my patients.
Oh, wow.
And she doesn't have any dementia or mental decline or anything like that, but it makes me have a better understanding of what it was like growing up in the 50s.
Yeah. It's a different world. They've seen so much. They've lived through so much. And it's interesting because, like, for any of the non-Jewish listeners, also, there's this really morbidly beautiful tradition in Judaism where, like, they always say, like, let's say for whatever reason, on the same day you're invited to a funeral and a wedding, and you have to choose which one to go to, you're supposed to go to a funeral, because it reminds you of your own mortality, and it makes you really, like, it puts things into perspective, right? And so you're really being put into perspective every single day. That's a lot. Like, it's really beautiful. Like, we need more people like you. And I feel like that's definitely, it sounds like your father's legacy coming through, but in your own unique twist, which is really cool,
Thank you. I actually never heard that about if you have to choose between a wedding or a funeral.
Really?
It makes a lot of sense. Because also, like, when there's, like, there's a saying that you know who your real friends are when everyone's grieving. Because if there's a wedding, if there's something happy going on, everybody wants to be a part of it. But if somebody died, then people tend to try and stay away from it because it's too hard.
What we should do?
We
should do like some PSAs for people right now, because like, okay, so I'll lead and we'll flow with it. But like, for example, the first time I ever really dealt with death, I was very blessed because I didn't really deal with it. Well, my grandfather passed away when I was in second grade, but I was really little and I didn't really know him that well, so I could kind of relate to you in that way. Just a little sob story for a moment. I was bullied at the time and I had to leave to go to his funeral.
And the girls were like, oh, you're lying. He didn't die. You just want to leave school early. That was like one of the first like bullying moments that I really remember. And I was like 8 years old and I was like, no, my grandfather really died. And they didn't believe me. I know. That was a little trauma that just came up now. But yeah, but like I didn't really register because I was like 8, right? Like I didn't really know what it meant. And then my grandmother this is my dad's parents because he's older, and like she had passed when I was like 5, and so he passed when I was 8. But then until then I was like in this little family bubble. Like I had my mom's parents, and then it was like all my aunts and uncles and cousins in St. Louis, and then my parents. So I grew up in this like little bubble where like I almost felt invincible because I had those generations, right? And then when I was 19, my grandfather passed away, and it rocked my world in the worst way possible because like I just was so angry with him for dying. Like I kept thinking about like, how can life keep going on? Like there's so many memories that I'm creating that I want him here for, and he's not going to be. And that was so hard for me. And I think the hardest thing about grieving and loss is that eventually the pain doesn't really go away, but it becomes manageable, and you create new memories, and you do laugh again, and you do have new family traditions, and they're different, but it's weird. It's definitely weird. But like I remember when he passed, it was really great because so many of my friends like tried to reach out in whatever way, but grieving is weird and people don't know how to reach out, especially during Shiva, like the mourning process. People say some pretty not cool stuff. But one beautiful thing was like I had a friend who reached out and she called me, and all my friends were in seminary that year. So like they called me from Israel, which was awesome. And she was like, I wish I knew what to say or what I could do. And I was like, honestly, like just showing up, just calling and saying hi, like I'm thinking about you, means so much more than you could possibly know. But I want to know from your perspective, like obviously you were so little when you lost your dad, but you had this almost like not almost, you did, like there was a gap where you didn't have that father growing up, but hearing how amazing he was. So like, what do you like to hear from people? What do you not like to hear from people? Like what's, especially also going to those Shabbatones where you like you've heard all different types of people from different walks of life talk about what it's like growing up without a parent. What should people say or not say? How should people support those they love in that situation?
It's really funny. Like, well, not funny, but when you said that you were actually angry with your grandfather when he passed away.
Yeah.
My father had died when I was 6, so I didn't really grieve because I didn't really get it. I just kind of knew he was. I remember when my mother told me he passed away. I remember a little bit of the Shiva house, but not so much. I don't really remember the funeral at all. Actually, I wasn't there, but it was somebody's birthday. Dory Markowitz's birthday was the same day as my father's funeral. So I went to the party instead, which my mother and I have talked about. If we could do it again, I would have gone to the funeral. But yeah, so I don't remember that. But when I was a teenager, I kind of had I was upset, not necessarily with my father, but I was angry when people would tell me how much they loved him, because I had this like, you loved him, you had him as a teacher, you know what his voice sounds like, and I don't have any of that. And I had to kind of go through my own grief process 10 years later, sort of. And I did. I worked with a therapist to just kind of grieve, because grief is real and you need to feel it. You need to grieve. If you don't let yourself grieve, then the grief never goes away. But if you allow yourself to grieve in a healthy way, you kind of realize that the grief is never gone. The person who you miss is always going to be with you, and you will always miss them. But you're able to heal when you grieve. So like you'll always miss that person, and just in a healthy way, you'll heal from it. You'll realize they're with you. You'll feel them with you. So I'm very lucky that I was able to realize that when I was a teenager, because it took a few years for me to kind of get over that hump of realizing like you had him and I didn't have him. I do love hearing stories about him. Love hearing the stories that people had happen to them. So when somebody says like, oh, your father was so amazing, here's a story that I heard from somebody else, from somebody else, from somebody else. To me, that like gives so much room for things to be missing or things to be added, and it kind of makes the story into maybe a myth sort of did it happen, how did it happen, when did it happen, why did it happen, and no details are actually confirmed. So for me, it's really like if somebody wants to share something, I love hearing it, but I want to hear your personal story. Grief-wise, so one thing I do not like hearing is when people tell me that he's like watching over me. I know, like, and it sounds weird because I know he's watching over me.
Yeah.
So it's not like I have this weird like he's not watching over me feeling. It's more of a who are you to tell me what my father is doing right now, sort of, because I feel like people will cross a sort of boundary when they like have this person who they loved so much and they feel sort of connected, like he was like a father figure to me, so, and he is your father, so I'm able to kind of tell you what your father would be doing. I'm in a position to tell you. So for me, it's just like hearing that of like, which also somebody says to me, like, your father's watching over you. I can't really say anything to that. Like, oh, thank you.
Right.
But
Yeah.
it's not something I'd be like, actually, yeah, I know he is, but how do you know he is?
Right. People just don't know what to say. And I think this is something in general. I mean, this is true for any topic of conversation when people are trying to be somewhat helpful, I guess, is people always say, oh, well, they mean well, right? But it's like, I think that's why this is such an important conversation, because like, let's spread it out there. Like, what are the boundaries? Like, what can people say and not say? So stories, obviously, it's really awesome to hear because then it just kind of, connects some of the dots, creates this bigger picture of that person. I've heard from people, even if they had a lifetime with someone and they lost them, there's still so many elements of that person that maybe you didn't know, because we all have different experiences with each person we come across, right? But I could see how that would be a thing where it's like, oh, he's watching over you. It's like, I don't feel comforted by that per se. Like, it doesn't take away from the loss.
Right. It's like with Shiva houses. It's actually an Indian, I guess, that if you come to a Shiva house, you're not allowed to speak until the person who's mourning speaks to you. And everybody, I see on Facebook groups, people always ask, like, what do you do when you go? Because it's so uncomfortable just sitting there. But the whole point of going is just to show the person, I'm here with you. And there's an amazing book that it's a children's book. It's called The Rabbit Listened. I love the story. Whenever I read it to my kids, I cry. It's a story about, there's a kid, he did something, he built something, and then it's very vague. It's like, and then something happened and everything came tumbling down. And then chicken came and said like, oh, cluck, cluck, let's talk about it. But the boy didn't want to talk. And then the bear came and said, let's roar about it. But the boy didn't want to roar. And then the ostrich said, let's hide and never talk about it. And the boy didn't want to do that. And then it goes through a bunch of different animals, like a hyena was laughing, the boy didn't want to laugh. And then all the animals stayed for a little bit, but then they left because the boy wasn't responding to them. And then the rabbit comes and hops in and sits next to the boy just silently. And the boy looks at the rabbit and says, don't leave me. And then I'm like feeling choked up now. And the boy starts talking about it, and then starts yelling about it, and then starts laughing about it, and goes through all of the different emotions, talks about how he's going to break somebody else's, talks about how he's going to build something even better. And the rabbit just sits there and listens. And at the end, the boy looks at the rabbit and he says, I can't wait, because one day I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do it so much better, and it's going to be amazing. And that's really what like a Shiva house is. It's really what like support is for anybody, really. If you want to be there for a person, you're just there for them. You don't need to fill the silence.
Yeah.
So what your friend did when she like called you and she said, I don't know what to say, like that's exactly what somebody who needs support needs, is somebody to just say, like, I don't know what to say, but I'm here for you. I love you. So yeah, PSA for if you want to support anybody, but also somebody grieving. Just be the rabbit, I guess. Just listen.
Have you ever heard the, I don't know the source for this. I wish I did, but I think this is just beautiful. I remember learning this in school where if you take your two ears and you look at the shape, it's,
Yeah.
right? Isn't that cute?
Yeah.
If you love someone, you'll listen to them, right?
That.
Isn't that so great? And I think that's why therapy has just blown up, because some people don't have people in their life, but a lot of us do. But there's something about having someone who's just going to be there objectively, authentically for you. And the way they ask questions is like, well, how do you feel about that? And it's just, and then I think we need that. Like we crave it, you know? I think that's why it's so powerful, like with therapy, and why people, even technically, even though they could be done with it and graduate, they continue and stay on.
Right. It's really, I know somebody who's a therapist, and she told me about an ad that she saw, that the ad was, everybody deserves an hour. It's just like an hour a week to just talk about what you need. And everybody deserves that. You don't need to have a crisis going on in your life.
We're going to call this episode that.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone deserves an hour. I love that.
It's so true.
Yeah.
Like, people think that they need to have a crisis or something like going on that they really just can't manage to go to therapy. But sometimes you just need to talk, and you deserve an hour. It's just an hour. Totally.
It's so cool. And even as a barista, like I feel like I'm a mini psychologist.
You're basically a therapist.
For real. I've actually did some digging in like the barista world on like social media. And so you know how like therapists, there's this concept of transference, where a lot of times people will fall for their therapist or think their therapist is like their best friend or like all these things, right? Apparently transference is also true for bartenders and for baristas. Isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. Especially women baristas, because like, especially for men, when you're like being maternal and like you're serving them something, and then you're also like that constant, right? Because I asked my manager when I first started being a barista, I'm like, why are people so trusting of me? It's so weird. Like they don't know me. I'm like, oh, the things that people tell me, it's wild. I've had 3 people cry to me this week in the coffee shop. And one person I had just met for the first time, and all I did was say, hey, you look like you're having a rough day. What's going on? Wasn't expecting it to turn into that deep of a therapy session. But she's like, a lot of adults, especially if they're like independent, living on their own, like they don't have a mom, they don't have someone touching base per se. So if you just give them just that tiny window of being like, hey, here's a little space for you. What's up? Then they're like, ooh, so glad you asked, because here's my life story, right? It's powerful. It's also, how often does somebody ask somebody, like, how are you? And they actually want you to give an answer. Mm-hmm. Actually, you want to know how I'm doing? Okay, well, this is bothering me, and this is sad, and this is hard. And no, you always just want to hear, oh, I'm doing well. I'm doing great. Fine. And then it's all just surface level conversation. But like a barista, somebody who like, if you like, you're asking like, how is this person? You're a complete stranger, but they'll open up completely because they know you also, like if their friend asks, how are you? They know their friend might not mean it, but if you're asking, you're like a complete stranger, they can open up, they can talk to you, and you can walk away and never see them again. Right. Right. Technically, you just don't go to that coffee shop ever again if you feel like you opened up too soon or too much. Right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's really cool. I think there's also just, it's hard as human beings to take a step back and listen, especially as someone with ADD, and people with ADHD have this too. Sometimes when you're talking to someone and they tell you something, you jump in with your story or something similar, which I know I've being a podcast host has given me a lot of insight to my conversation skills, because sometimes I'll like look back at the conversation and I'll be like, let them talk. You interrupted like 10 times. But it's just more about my way of like connecting and relating to someone is by being like, oh, I've been there. I resonate. I align with you. And then, but that's not what people need. They need you to just be like, let them finish talking and then share your story. So it's
Also,
interesting.
yeah, I also have ADHD, and whenever a patient says something, like there's a thing, like therapists don't share so much with their patients about, or their clients about what's going on in their life. And sometimes somebody will say something and I'm just like, I have to remind myself, like, nope, do not tell a personal story. You do not need to like let them know this is what happened to you and you've been in the same boat, because that's not what they need. That's not why they're here. But yeah, whenever I'm talking to a friend, I have to like check myself, like, do they need me to share a personal story also? Because like, it's just second nature for me to share, like, oh yeah, I also have that.
Right. It's how we connect, right?
Mm-hmm.
You just have to, yeah. And if it happens, it happens. We can't be too hard on ourselves. We have to give ourselves like a little bit of grace, but it is so powerful. So what are some other like PSAs, like things that maybe some other people from like these Shabbatones have mentioned that's just, they don't like when people say?
Well, so the Shabbatones, I went when I was a teenager, so that was a while ago.
Right. Which is crazy. We're not going to discuss that.
I mean, they're fun, like, just like, really, I think the one thing that a lot of people feel is like when you act like you know my parent more than me is really like the one thing that a lot of my friends have like had common ground on.
You checked me on that one. You checked me on that one. Like when we first connected, you were saying something about it. And then I was like, I had heard so many stories that I was like, I kind of felt like I knew your dad too. So then like, also my mind's like, my memory's warped. So I was like, oh yeah, I remember your dad. Your dad was like a legend. And I'm just trying to be like supportive and nice. And you're just like, respectfully.
I remember this.
Yeah. You were like, respectfully, you're younger than me and I don't remember my dad. So I'm not really sure how you do. And I was like, yeah, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. You're not wrong. And I apologize publicly for that. But I think that was really cool that you were able to like share that, because yeah, it's a little full of yourself to like, you're like, oh, I heard a story, so therefore I know, not thinking about how that affected you or how that made you feel.
Well, I'm sorry that I like called you out.
No, I literally, can I tell you, maybe I just like tough love, but I even had a situation recently where like someone called me out where like I wasn't sharing, like they DM'd me, they asked me a question and I was like, I don't want to share that. And then there really was no reason why I shouldn't have shared it. I don't know why. I was just like in my head about it. And in person, I was like, I don't know why I wasn't open. I'm sorry. And then I shared it with them and they're like, yeah, listen, you're not that important. And I was like, true. Which I know sounds harsh, but it's like sometimes you have to separate the messenger from the message, right? In the end of the day, like we're all so self-absorbed. We all have so much going on. Like I think sometimes we get into our head, we're like, I need to not share certain things or whatever. And it's just like, I think that's why I really love doing what I do with the podcast. And it took me a long time, even throughout this journey, to be more open and like the types of conversations that I have. And it's been a learning curve for me, because the truth is, as a consumer, when I would listen to podcasts, I always loved the podcasts where I felt like there was a story or they shared an insight or a vulnerability. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm not alone. Like, this is how people feel. That's so cool. Like, I needed that, because I think we all have moments of like depression where we feel alone and no one can understand us. And even though you do have your own unique story, it is important to realize that like we need to share, because that's what connects us and that's what makes us feel less alone.
I agree with that. Just on the one story you shared though about it, I feel like if somebody has something that they don't want to share about, like, everybody is special and everybody is unique and everybody has their own stories, and it could be that it might not be such a special story or such a special moment and like it's something that could have been shared, but everyone's also entitled to privacy. So I feel if you don't want to share something, you don't have to.
Yeah, it is weird though, because like I even remember like when I first started, like this is a different person, but they were just like, where do you live? And not like address wise, but like just like, oh, like where are you from? What do you do? That kind of thing. And I had grown up like pre social media, right? Like I didn't get social media till I was like 21. And just also growing up like super from like there was a lot of privacy and like you didn't share certain things. I was like, oh, I'd rather not say. And then I remember they stopped following me after that. I was like, oh, interesting. But you're right. I guess it's a balance about figuring out like what are you vulnerable about and then what are you private about. And really that's your decision to make. Whether people like it or not, they could come and go.
Also, with that, like for me, there's some things that I'm very open about, and then there's some things that I wouldn't necessarily want to talk about. But then I have 6 other siblings that they might feel like some things I might be so open about, they might just be like, wait, that's something we don't talk about. Or for them, there's something that they like. All my siblings are a lot older than me, so I experience life a lot differently than a bunch of them. So for them, like for me, something might be a really big deal, and it was a really hard trauma of I don't even like know what, but for them, it was just a random Tuesday.
Right.
So everybody just experiences the same situations differently, and everybody processes differently.
Totally. So going into now, if you're comfortable sharing on that note, asking permission about it. But being a parent now, it sounds like you love being a mom, like you love kids. And obviously you are very, I feel like a reflective person because like the fact that you did a career shift so that you can show up and be the best mom possible really shows like, I feel like how good of a mother you are. So that being said, like, how does that experience translate for you, right? Because you knew what it was like to grow up in a single parent home and having that loss of a parent, but now your kids are growing up in like a regular 2 parent home. What does that feel like for you? Is that ever like a surreal moment? Or are you more cognizant of certain memories because you want to give maybe your kids an experience that maybe you didn't have?
Actually, I was just talking to somebody about this. There are some things that I'm much more aware of in like my son he's 5 now. He's turning 6. He doesn't know how old I was when my father passed away because he's also very interested in the idea of death, like always has been, because he's named after my father who's dead, which is also, it sounds weird, but it's a very normal thing for like little kids to be interested in this concept because it's hard for them to wrap their heads around like if they see like a dead deer on the side of the road, it's very hard for them to wrap their heads around this concept of it was moving, now it's not. So when there's they become interested in it. And so I don't want him to know how old I was until he's a few years older because I don't want him to connect it to how old he is now.
Yeah, or have that fear.
Right. But seeing him do all these like milestones, like tonight he read Hop on Pop to me and half of it. And it just kind of like makes me think of like, I started reading before my father had passed away. So like, did I ever do something like that? Or like the fact that he is turning 6. And I'm like, okay, when I turned 6, my father died a month and 10 days later. So in my head, there's like just like this jarring, like 6 is a scary age, but also my son is like, thank God, a completely normal and healthy child and will continue to be a normal and healthy child. So I sometimes have to check myself with like, he is a normal and healthy child and I shouldn't, let my own feelings or fears or, anxieties kind of get in the way of realizing that he's a normal and healthy child. My husband and kids were in a car accident in September, actually. This year in September, like 2 weeks before Rosh Hashanah, I think. Baruch Hashem, everybody's okay, everybody's fine. When it happened, like, I got that scary phone call nobody ever wants, where my husband called me and I was like, oh, is everything okay? And he yelled, he's like, no, everything's not okay. We were in an accident on this like intersection. And then he hung up the phone. And I had this fear, oh my God, is everybody okay? Is everybody alive? Thank God it happens to be right next to a lawyer's office, and he actually is the lawyer helping us with this lawsuit. but he's also a friend of mine. So he was at the scene and he started texting me pictures of the kids to show me they were okay as I was like driving to get to them. My husband's car was totaled. The other car had flipped over. The other guy got out of his car, which was upside down, and he was holding on to his weed joint, and he was high and he was drunk, and worst case scenario of like total DUI. It was carpool, so it was on the way to school, so a lot of kids who were going to school watched the accident happen. So I was like on all these like school chats, people are like, does anybody know who it is? Is it from family? Is everybody okay? Did somebody call it, sell it? I'm like seeing these messages pop up. I got there, Baruch Hashem, like we're in the ambulance, going to the hospital. And I remember this feeling of like some of my core memories are in a hospital.
Yeah.
My earliest memories are like my father was only sick for 6 months, so that's not a long time. But I do have like these random memories of, I don't remember my father's face, but I remember walking next to somebody holding an IV pole. And I remember looking at the IV pole. So, like, I have this memory, and I have a memory of, like, the Beaker Cholim room in Barnes Jewish, and, like, I remember having a conversation with, like, somebody about if the coffee pot is kosher, because I was 6 and didn't understand the concept of, like, what is kosher. Yeah. So it's just, like, these random memories, and I was, like, had this fear of my son is in a hospital. I mean, both of my sons and my husband. Baruch Hashem. Again, like my husband had bruising. One of my sons had to get stitches. The other one he sprained his vertebrae, but he sprained the ones that are the C4 and C5, which are, I guess, I've been told they're the best ones to sprain because they aren't attached to the brain or the spine or something. So he was in a neck brace for a few weeks, but they healed. He's fine. Everybody's good. Mm-hmm. But I was just telling somebody about this of like when my son was like getting an MRI, I was like had this fear of like he's gonna have this memory of like being in a hospital and he's a baby and it's one of his first memories. And I'm like, I have to realize it's a different situation also with he's in the hospital bed and versus like when I was little, I was visiting somebody. But I do have these random times where there's like a connection in my head of like from when I was little to him now, because we're around the same age of when my father had passed away. And I do just keep reminding myself like, it's not the same thing.
That's so scary. I mean, I think in general, I'm not a parent, but I have heard that being a parent, first there's your own personal journey as an adult and growing up and your own healing process for whatever you've been through in life. Then getting married is a whole other thing. That person's a mirror to you and brings out all these other insecurities and beautiful things, and it's another growth process. And then the next tier is being a parent, right? And like your kids really bring out a whole other side of you to work on. And this is a perfect example in a really unique situation where it's like, that's such a wild situation to be in where like all these almost like repressed memories are coming through in a way that you probably didn't even realize were there, weren't even expecting. And just being a mom and watching your kids go through that is super traumatizing. Honestly, the whole story is really terrifying, and I'm really glad that everyone's okay.
Yeah, thank God. It was the best case scenario for the situation. So
yeah,
but it's so true. Like just all the different stages, different things come up. Even like I was a teacher. So the first year I taught 4th grade, I wasn't married. I got married like a week before school finished or something. And then the next year I was pregnant with my son. And then the next year I had like a baby. And my first year teaching, I had so much patience. I was so fun. I was so energetic. I would like joke all the time with my kids about everything. And like, I would sit on the floor in the middle of class because I didn't feel like standing. And it was just, I had a lot of fun with it. And then the next year I was like exhausted all the time. And then the next year I was a mom. And I like realized I always thought I was a really patient person. And then I realized that, no, it's really easy for me to separate myself from somebody I'm not emotionally attached to, which is a very big difference. Like my kids, I'm emotionally attached to. Everything they do, I'm connected to. I love them so much. And they test my patience every single day.
Yeah.
My students, they like were troublemakers and they were fun and they would call out and sometimes they were disrespectful. And I wasn't emotionally attached to them. So it wasn't disrespectful to me.
And you can go home at the end of the day, right? Like you're almost like on when you're dealing with them because it's work mode, right? Versus like your kids, there's no break. They're
Right.
there when you're sick. They're there when you're tired. You know, they're there when, like, I think we all could say that we run best when our home is clean and organized. But the reality is life happens. And especially if you have kids and little kids, your house is not going to be organized all the time unless you're like some like angel or something, or you have good cleaning help. And like that affects things too, you know, like just the utter chaos, which is sometimes so beautiful and you appreciate it, but other times it's a lot. So honestly, I've always been in a lot of awe of moms because I know it's not easy. So I respect it a lot.
Yeah, it's just a lot to learn, really, like how to, like, there's some things that I always imagine, like, my home is going to be like this. Like, I remembered when I was little, like, we always, like, everybody sings Shabbos songs all the time at the table. In my house, it was like an open door. Everybody came over whenever they wanted. There were people there at all hours of the night. And, like, I was a little kid and didn't have a bedtime because everybody else was so much older. And, like, there was no bedtime. And I always just kind of had this vision of, like, my home being the same way. And then now I'm, like, an adult and I realize I'm not equipped to having that type of home, at least at this moment. You know, like, I'm not, like, we sing Shabbos songs at the table, but that's not all of it. And, you know, I love when friends come over, but I, you know, would like them to, like, text me beforehand, kind of a thing.
Totally. Yep.
Right? Like, so it's just, like, also this reality check of how do I make what I imagined work with me currently?
Right. Right. While we were talking, I have a hard question for you.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fun, challenging question, but it's hard too. So my sister-in-law, her mother passed away when she was little. I'm fuzzy about the exact age. I want to say it was between the ages of 10 and 12. So it was young that she doesn't really remember that much, but she was a little older than you. And her mom passed away in a car accident. So when you were telling me the story about your family, it brought back this memory. And she had a really good friend whose parent passed away, who was sick for a long time. And they always, so my sister-in-law went to school one day and had a mom, and she came home and did not. It was that fast in one day. And her friend watched this role model of hers get sick and be in such a vulnerable state. And they would always have this ongoing argument about which is worse, right? Is it worse to like lose a parent instantly, or is it worse to watch like your role model pass away? Because like just sharing a little bit more about my story with my dad, I can't remember if I do have an episode called Daddy Issues, and it's not what people would think. It's actually my friend, she's in her 40s, and her dad also has dementia. So we were talking about what it's like to have dads with dementia, but it's also interesting because like I'm in my 20s, I was young 20s when my dad got diagnosed, and I felt gypped. I'm like, I'm too young. I should be living La Vida Loca. I shouldn't be worrying about this at this point. But the health issues with my dad actually started a lot earlier. It started when I was 12. He had 96% heart blockage, and he knew my mom was afraid of hospitals. My mom's a first grade teacher, and my dad drove himself to the hospital, and immediately they knew something was wrong. And he calls my mom. She doesn't answer because she's teaching. He calls her, leaves her a voice note, and says, or a voicemail, not a voice note. That's so modern of me. He left a voicemail and he was like, hi, honey. I just wanted to let you know that I have 96% heart blockage and I'm going into open heart surgery. So I will call you when I'm done.
Oh my God.
So
Poor mother.
I know. She hates hospitals. Like my mom has such a fear and an aversion to hospitals, like so much. My mom recess checks her phone, gets that voicemail, panics, and I remember 12 years old, like going to the hospital. And by the time we got there, he was out of heart surgery. And to this day, my dad's a walking miracle. Like the things that he's been through, it's been insane, and he's insane. But he somehow, after open heart surgery, because he's so freaking in love with my mom and he's a little insane, he borrowed some nurses, like, I remember they were like this, like maroon, rose colored, whatever. It's weird how you remember certain details. And he was standing by the parking lot with his IV and all these tubes just everywhere, waiting for my mom to make her feel comfortable. And then he's just like walking us through the hospital. And somehow this man's been there one day. He knows everybody's names. He's like flirting with all the nurses. Hey, how you doing? Like my dad didn't know a stranger. And we're just in shock following him. And then finally he's in bed, exhausted, right? And I remember seeing him like just so weak. And that was like the first time I got super angry, where I was just like, I realized that for me, I don't get like sad or scared. I just get angry. And I just remember like yelling at my dad, don't you dare die. Like, don't get sick anymore. I was so scared. And then like somehow he got better. He healed after that. He always had type 2 diabetes like since I was 8. And then he kind of did okay health-wise throughout high school. But then when I was 20, he got diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer. Survived that somehow. And then like a few years later, had a stroke. Thank God I watched Grey's Anatomy because I knew what to do.
You were there.
He had it in my arms.
Oh my God. Wow.
I was saying to him so fast that I don't even think I was saying it anymore. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation where you're just like so panicked and like that's like your thing. And then I remember like my dad came out of it and all of a sudden he's like stroking out. And then all of a sudden he looks up at me. He like grabs my arm and he's like, slow down. I'm like, sir, you slow down. I'm panicking right now. But there was so many like falls and like scary situations that we've had over the years. And it's just like, I'm thinking about like your situation versus my situation where it's like both suck if we're being honest. But it's like, it goes back to that age-old question, like, what do you think is worse? Is it worse to just suddenly lose a parent? Or is it worse to be kind of like me where it's like, have all these health issues and feel like in a weird way, I feel like I've been afraid to connect with my dad to a certain degree because I always felt like he was slipping through my fingers. And I've been like mentally preparing myself that my dad's going to die since I was 12 and I'm 28. So what do you think is worse? There's no wrong answers. I'm just making conversation.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, there's a reason it's an age-old question. I don't know. I have a friend who her father he was very sick for years, on and off with various things. And I remember in 8th grade, he was very sick, and there was like one Shabbos where they said that he wasn't going to make it through Shabbos. And Motzei Shabbos, I called her, and I was like, how are you? And she was like, he's still alive. And I was like, okay, I'm coming over with pizza. And I told my mother that we're going to go pick up pizza, and I like went over and I slept over. And
You're
it
such a
was
good
me.
friend.
I had to do something. It was me and my friend and her sister, and we just were up and like playing Trivial Pursuit and just kind of like, okay, he's not making it through the night. He lived for another like 12 years, I want to say. And there were so many times where they had that, like, he's not going to make it through the night. And it was so hard for like the family, for my friend, to like you said, to feel like to try and connect with him, to, open up to him, because he was a ticking time bomb. And they didn't, like, it's natural to not want to get hurt. And the closer you are to somebody, the more hurt you'll be.
Right.
But like, so from her point of view, she was just kind of like, I wish I didn't go through that 12 years of like not knowing what's going to happen. And I was like, I kind of wish I went through that, like, 20 years of not knowing what's going to happen, but having the person. But at the same time, can't imagine. Like for me also, it wasn't sudden. He was sick for 6 months. I can't imagine what that would be like. So like, I mean, I got that phone call of like my family was in a car accident. Thank God everybody was fine. But like, I don't know what I would have done if it was like something worse.
Right.
And I think both of them, they all just suck.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks whatever they have is like the worst situation also. So like for me, like I wish I had that like 20 years, right? Like that my friend had, but for her, she just kind of like, it'd be nice if she had the 20 years where he wasn't sick, or there was a time where he wasn't sick. Like I don't know which way she would prefer. I just think everybody thinks that the grass is greener on the other side.
Totally.
Even in morbidity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is a morbid question, right? But they make you pause, right? And even if someone's listening, whether they can relate to this or maybe their parents are totally healthy, it just kind of puts things into perspective. So I think it's like good to put out into the ether.
Yeah, for sure.
There's this podcast, I've quoted this before, but I love it. It's The School of Greatness with Lewis Howes. And I love his interview style. It's something that I definitely aspire to emulate because I feel like he's just so humble and like curious, like truly curious about his guests and making it about them. But he still shares about himself, but it's mostly about them. But there was one thing that he shared. His dad had a terrible accident, which was caused a brain injury. And his dad survived that brain injury for another 20 years, but was not the same person. He was very sick after that time period. Not dementia, but similar in terms of the results of it.
Like
And
traumatic brain injury.
yes, exactly. And he said this quote that really, I just love quotes. I love when things just capture your feelings and your emotions and your story just in a one-liner. And he said something that finally kind of helped me get to peace with my dad, which was I had to learn to mourn the man that he was while learning to love the man who he has become. It's surreal. Like if you have a parent who's aging or who's just not 100% there or who's had some sort of brain injury and there's a personality change, you have lost a parent to a certain extent, but they're still here. So it's really weird where you're just like, they're here, but they're not here, and learning to like navigate that, it's super strange, not gonna lie. But I think in terms of like all relationships that we have, we don't like to think this, but like every relationship in our life has an expiration date. The only two relationships that are forever from birth till death is the relationship with yourself and the relationship with God. That's it. Those are the only two relationships that are forever in your life. So just, well, with God, it's a choice, but you know, in theory,
Power.
right. In theory, if you want to tap in, it's there if you want it. But that being said, sometimes I think when relationships change, it's hard for us to like want to be in those relationships, whether it's friendships or relationships with family as we grow and evolve and change. But like unconditional love is really learning to love that person wherever they're at, you know?
It's like a really big thing to process. It's very true.
Right? And
Yeah.
I've had a little more time than you to process that. I did just throw that on you.
I love it. It's so true. With any relationship, honestly, like if you imagine something to be a certain way, you need to like be able to, I mean, just grieve the whatever you thought would happen and didn't happen, and also learn to love the situation in the here and now. Or not necessarily love, but live in the situation. Wow. That's like
Yeah.
really
My
incredible.
grandmother also would say, like, another spin on that is that, like, life is like an elevator ride, right? Where, like, you're there from start to finish, and there's going to be people that come on, and, like, they may be on for a few floors, but they're not necessarily going to be on for the entire time. So, like, I think something about with relationships is just not holding on too tight, like learning to appreciate and love each person while they're there in your life. But then also, if for whatever reason, like even let's say friendships, right? People move out of town, people get married, they have kids, like things evolve and change constantly. Sometimes you change as people and it just isn't a mesh anymore, even though the friendship was really beautiful at one point. And so it's just more about like just learning to appreciate each person for who they are in your life right now, but then also knowing that like there might be a time and a place when it isn't a fit anymore. And so learning to just kind of always be open to new relationships and not holding on too much to people either, right?
Right, like when you're in high school, you think all the people who you're in high school with, you're gonna know and love forever, and you write in everybody's yearbook, like keep in touch.
Yep.
And then, like my son told me recently, he was like, I said something about how I was like, all my friends, and he was like, Mommy, you only have 2 friends.
Leave it to kids. Leave it to kids to just call it out.
Yeah. I was like, yeah, I kind of only have like 2 friends. I have more friends. You don't know who they are because we're in touch with WhatsApp or Facebook.
Right.
But like, yeah, you everybody evolves. So even if you're friends with somebody, like in high school, like for me, I graduated like 12 years ago. So even if I have a friendship like with somebody from high school, we're completely different people now. And we like, the people who I'm still in touch with and I'm still close close with, we evolved together and accept each other as like who we are now. And not like, I'm not friends with the shadow that she was when she was 12. I'm friends with her now, and I was friends with her then. Oh, not, I mean, 12 years ago. But like, a lot of people, it's just too hard to let go of like who they remember being friends with.
Yeah, totally. And what's interesting about this podcast too is, I mean, like, for example, us reconnecting, right? Like, we haven't seen each other since we were in elementary school, but I've had people from high school who nothing bad happened. We just drifted apart. And then there's something weird about podcasts where like, it's that transference where you like hear the conversations and in your head you're kind of responding, and so you're like we're friends. And so I've had people who we were friends, we've lost touch, they'll listen to the podcast and we'll start reaching out, and then I'm like, I'm so glad you feel emotionally connected to me. I'm not present in the conversations that you're having with me too, right? You know, so it's not that we couldn't reconnect. It's just, it's an interesting dynamic that I wasn't expecting on this podcast journey, how like it's reconnecting me to like, oh my gosh, all kinds of people. And I think the best is my parents' friends. There's some of them who will find me on Facebook and they'll be like, oh, I saw you were on a radio show. That's really cool.
Horrible.
It's so great. I do want to ask you a fun, challenging question that my friend asked me. Since you're in like the therapy world, I think you'll appreciate it. Which is, obviously we're right in like the non-Jewish New Year's. It's January, but we're a little mid-January. Everyone's doing vision boards. Everyone's doing, you know, their manifestations and their mantras for the year. But personally, I had a psychologist who spoke to us in high school, and he said all expectations are unrealistic. And I hated that as a type A, as a recovering type A, and as someone who has a little more life under her belt, I've come to see how...
I love that term, recovering type.
I'm a recovering type A. Can I tell you, I had a boss, my first boss out of college, who was so wound tight that I was like, this is my future. If I don't chill out, this is my future. And I was like,
The Devil Wears Prada.
Literally. Great movie. That was a great reference. Yeah, I've been working really, I remember when I was 24, I was like, Ma, I'm chill. And she's like, in what universe are you a chill person? But now, 4 years later, like I've done a lot of inner work, and she's like, yeah, I honestly would describe you as pretty chill and sometimes too zen, too annoyingly so, but I worked on it because it's important to me. But that being said, this is the first year where I'm like, even like on Zos Hanukkah, like the last night of Hanukkah, like my mom and I have this tradition of like writing like letters, and then we open it the next year when we get the menorahs out.
Love that.
We do like a whole manifestation, like a letter to Hashem, and like I'll be totally honest. Last year, I wrote this whole letter where I was like, this time next year, I want to be here with like both my parents and my husband and my little baby. Well, my dad's in a nursing home, so I wasn't with both my parents this year. I'm not married and I don't have a kid. So I was like, that's depressing. Don't want to do that for next year. So it's more of like, I believe these things are going to happen, but I don't want to like be a type A and put a time frame on them anymore, right? So my friend gave me this challenge. It took me a long way to get here, but the challenge is, if you could have one word as your mission statement for this year, what would it be? So I'll let you think on this while I tell you my word. My word is surrender. I got really into Kabbalah this past year, and a big part of Kabbalah talks about how, like, let's say, for example, you want a soulmate. The worst thing you can do is look for a soulmate. The best thing you want to do is to connect to a higher power, God, like whatever that is for you. For me, it's God. So to connect with God, and then you'll just be a magnet. Like, be a soulmate, connect with God, and then you'll just be a magnet for it. And so like this year in my letter, I wrote, I just want to connect to God. I just want to connect to the light. I want to be like the best version of myself. And I want to surrender, where it's like, I'm going to show up. I'm going to do my best. But then whatever's meant to be will be. It will unfold when it's supposed to unfold. And if I feel anxiety or stress, it's because I'm trying to control an uncontrollable, right? So my word is surrender.
That's a really great one. I think I'm going to go with connecting, because like I want this year, like, again, I just started kind of trying to find like my father's students and hear stories about him. So I'm like going to use this year to hopefully learn how to connect more with him and with my family. I also hope with this project I'll like connect more with like my siblings, my mother. In general, just work on relationships and just connection.
You know, something I want to do too, because I know you're trying to get like a bunch of stories together by your dad's yahrzeit, but I think this can be an ongoing thing. Because the thing about podcasts is people find it when they find it, right? Like someone could find this in 5 years from now. But I want to do a link to that post. So this way, anybody who hears this, if they think of a story and they for some reason aren't connected to you, then they can go and share that way.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I set up an email address. It's Rabbi Pollack Stories. So Rabbi, Rabbi, Pollack, Pollack, Stories, Stories, at gmail.com. So anybody who has a story. So far I have like 15 people sent me stories or memories, you know. Somebody sent me one from like my parents lived in Massachusetts, like in the 80s, early, like before they moved to St. Louis. All my older siblings were all born in Massachusetts, and somebody from there messaged me that like my father was a very big man. He was 6'4". He was very broad. He was overweight. My mother is a very tall, skinny woman. So she like messaged me. She was like, "Oh, we would call your parents Brutus and Olive Oil from Popeye behind their backs." And I'm just like, that is the best thing. Like,
Yeah.
some random like show from like the 50s. Like, so I just like, I'm getting all these random stories. So if anybody knows of something in 5 years, if you see this podcast, that email address is open.
Yeah, totally. And I'll have it in the link below as well. So this way people can just message directly as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. Is there anything else that you would like to share for tonight? Because I want to make sure like this is your time. So it's a safe space.
Thank you. I feel like we covered so many topics.
It's the ADD and the ADHD coming out.
Totally. This is fun. We should just talk like regular also.
Oh no, this is the beginning of a friendship for sure. Totally. Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you reached out. Like this is, I think, talking about connection, I think the podcast has brought so much connection to my life. Yeah, in all areas too, because like, I don't know about you, but sometimes I could be a little shy about like asking someone to talk or catch up or go out for coffee. But if I want to connect with someone, my move is just be like, hey, do you want to come on the podcast? Because it's such a great way to connect. And then either if it's a good connection, we can like build, or if it's not, I got a great story and have a nice life, you know? Mm-hmm. So it's been really special.
Yeah, I remember like when I think it was when you had Mrs. Height on, and I listened to it, and you were saying something like similar to that of like, this is a great way for you to like connect with people. And at that exact time, I was like having this like internal struggle of like, am I gonna try and like publicize that I'm trying to get these stories, and am I like, I think also like again, my son had asked me like about like a certain type of story about my father, and I had this whole like thing where I was feeling just like I need to have a more of a connection with him. So when I was hearing your podcast with Mrs. Height and having that same feeling at that exact moment, I was like, I'm just going to reach out and see what happens. And I love that I did, because I'm definitely not the type of person to take that plunge and like put myself out there.
But now you are.
Right now I did, so I can say that I am.
Yeah, because it just takes doing it once too, right? Like even with the podcast, like I've met so many people who want to do the podcast, and I've had people who are like, especially in the beginning, they're like, wow, you look so confident and so poised. And I'm like, I'm so glad that that's how it came across, because I was sweating through my clothes. I went through a lot of deodorant. I couldn't feel my tongue in the first few episodes. Like, I think the first 11 episodes, like, I would have, like, that paper tongue at the end of the episode where I'm like, I can't breathe. I hope that turned out well. Sometimes I'll look back at episodes and I'm like, oh, thank God, because I'm pretty sure I just blacked out and I have no idea what I said. So I'm glad it comes across well. But hearing you say that, I mean, first of all, the fact that you reached out, thank you. But also, like, the fact that it helped you is exactly what I'm talking about. Like, that's my whole mission, where it's like, even if someone isn't going to reach out to be on the episode, it's just more about like, you're not alone. And maybe it sparks something in you to inspire you to do something, right? Yeah. Okay, so I do have this tradition. This whole podcast, like we were just saying, it's based on this Hebrew quote from Pirkei Avos, which is "Eze hu chacham halomei mikol adam," which means one who is wise is one who learns from everyone. And we have learned so much from you. So if you can leave us with one last little favorite quote or life lesson.
So my favorite quote is it's from J.M. Barrie, who's the author of Peter Pan.
Yes.
And it is, God gave us memories so we might have roses in December. Which I love that quote because life is so complicated and it's so easy to like just be in a funk, or when things are hard, it's so easy to like get stuck in this mindset of things are hard and things are hard. And
Yeah.
I always try when like I personally am going, like when I'm struggling with anything, I try and remember like what is good, what will be good, what, brought me here that was good, and, what life lessons am I going to have at this moment. And I just try and remember the roses in December.
That's so beautiful. I love that. And the funny thing about memories too is that, especially good ones, sometimes you don't realize how special a moment is until like it is a memory and you're reflecting on it. And it was like not even something planned. It's not, sometimes just those random spur of the moment memories. There's this song, it's called Fireflies by Owl City, if anybody knows it.
I love that song.
I hate that song, but it's such a classic. But like every time I hear it, especially music, I think music is a huge like memory thing for sure. I just remember this. I don't even remember how old I was. Maybe I was like in my early 20s. My mom and I were sitting in my car. This song came on, and my mom just was like rocking out to it. And then we're just like singing funnily. And like every time it says Fireflies, we're just doing like the little random little spurts. And then I just remember that like we had my car windows out, and I just had we both had our feet just sticking out the car window. We were parked. I wasn't driving like this.
That's good.
But yeah, it was just like a random memory, and it's so silly, but that's like one of my favorite memories, and I always remember that when I hear that song. Yeah.
Yeah. For Hanukkah, we just got my son it's called the 24/6. It's like this MP3 player that has Jewish music on it.
I love that.
It has like everybody.
That's based on that radio station 24/6, right?
So it is that radio station made it.
That makes me laugh so much when I saw that the first time. I was like 24/6. I freaking love that.
Right. So it's amazing. But now he like walks around and he's playing all these songs, and I'm like, I'll hear like a random like country Yessie song that I'm like, I haven't heard that song since like I was 5, or like this random like Miami Boys choir. Like it's
Oh, the
so
Miami Boys.
Yes. Like hearing all these songs, and like music just brings you back to where you were when you heard it. So it's like I like randomly I'll like have this flashback to like some random thing. Like I'm like fighting with my brother and this song is playing in the background. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, it could be to anything. Do you remember the Marvelous Meadows Machine?
Oh my gosh, yeah. And they play all the time.
Yep. I honestly want to be a mom just so that I can like relive some of these childhood memories. If I have girls, I hope they like Barbie. I want to watch the Barbie movies over again.
I took my husband.
Did you?
I needed to see it so badly, and we never go out.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, we're going to go, and I'll let you choose the movie, and the right movie to choose is Barbie.
That's right.
And we went. The whole time I just was laughing my head off. It was amazing.
It's so funny. But even like the classic Barbie movies too, like the animated ones, like the illustrated ones.
Like the Rapunzel and...
That was my childhood.
I watched those with Tari Ozar. And her like...
You know, her husband's last name is Nechemkin. I think that's how you say it. But I always thought it was so funny because I'm like, if I would have married him, my name would have been Nechama Nechemkin. And no one would have taken me seriously. I don't know the guy. I just know the last name. And I was just like, no. I wouldn't. People would have met me and they'd be like, you're not real.
You would have been one of those stories of like Genentel and Nechama Nechemkin.
Literally. Oh my God. This has been so great. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to continue this friendship off camera. And I'm really glad you reached out to me. So I guess we really have your dad inadvertently to thank for this connection, because if he had never taught my brother, and then my brother wouldn't have ever been inspired by it, we wouldn't have talked about it. Who knows, right? So it's funny how things all connect. But
Full
thank you so
circle.
much. Yeah. Thank you so much for being so vulnerable. I know how hard it can be to be vulnerable in general, but especially like creating this safe space where it is just you and I talking right now. But the fact that you're willing to share this with the world and my audience, I really appreciate it. And I know that there's going to be people who definitely appreciate it and it's going to be impactful. So you're the best. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I'm so excited to like just reconnect. Like,
Yeah, totally. And see how it all comes together. So yeah, thank you guys for listening and for watching. And we are going to be, if you're just listening to this, the video version is on Spotify and YouTube. And please, if this was meaningful for you, which it should be, you should just please share with your friends and your family and just spread the love. And if you're not already subscribed, please do your girl a favor and subscribe. And I hope you guys have a great week. Let's get it. Let's go.